Okay, hello chess players. I got a request to do a video on positional sacrifices, like positional sacrifices of a pawn, sometimes positional sacrifices of a whole piece, but basically sacrificing material in exchange for some sort of positional compensation as opposed to something incredibly concrete like checkmate. Anyways, if you like content like this and want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So this is actually a really difficult question, and the way the question was asked, in a lot of ways, made it even more difficult. Was are these sacrifices based on intuition, or is there something more? Is there concrete rules and things that we can put in place to determine when to sacrifice this material for these kinds of reasons? And the answer to that question is yes on both. These sacrifices are largely based on intuition and experience, but yes, there are also, rules and logic behind these sacrifices as well. And you need both. So let's sort of dive right in and look at some really famous kind of positional sacrifices and how they work. So the first sacrifice I'm going to take a look at was a Karpov game. This was like when I was taught positional sacrifices, this was always the game that inevitably got showed. It was Anatoly Karpov was playing the white pieces, and they basically play an exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit Declined, and then Karpov brings his queen to c2. This was Karpov versus Yusupov, played back in 1988. So again, this goes back to my childhood. And again, this was the game that everybody liked to show back then to show how positional sacrifices worked. So this is how people played it back then. They don't want black to play bishop f5. Black plays g6. They basically insist on playing bishop f5. And actually, this is still sort of the modern way to play it when people try to get their bishop outside the pawn chain like this. I play it a little bit differently myself. My preference is not to do this and to do sort of a hybrid of the old school way, which is to castle, but then insert kind of a fresh idea in this position. And for more details on all of that theory, you can check out my Queen's Gambit Declined series, which is actually quite good. But anyway, so g6 got played, and then we have e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e7, king takes e7. And then we have knight takes e4, d takes e4, queen takes e4. Now, of course, we do play these positions a little bit differently right now. Knight takes e4, for example. This move is actually a little questionable. Probably it was a little better to simply play d captures e4. But anyways, this is what got played in the game, and thanks to that, we get a relatively famous game. We had bishop c4, queen a5 check, king f1, queen f5, queen e3, knight d7, rook e1, rook a e8, and here's where we get the ever so critical move that everybody covers, is this move, this positional sacrifice with the move pawn to d5. Now, as far as pawn sacrifices go, this is sort of a theme sacrifice in a lot of ways. This is a sacrifice that does two things. It clears a square for your knight, for example, for like knight d4, but it is also sealing your opponent's pieces into the position. Now, one of the interesting things about like a lot of these positional sacrifices, even some of these really famous ones, is if you look at it on the engine, a lot of times there are alternatives to these sacrifices that are just as solid as sacrificing the pawn. So to a large extent, these sacrifices are preference. Um, but also, human experience has certainly taught us that making sacrifices like this increase your winning chances pretty significantly, because now your pieces are going to have squares to go to and your opponent's pieces don't. And even though the computer says, hey, that extra pawn, it compensates for that a little bit, on a very human level, it is way easier to play a position where you have a square for all of your pieces, as opposed to play a position where you got to dig out and find squares for all of your pieces. And that's essentially the essence of these positional sacrifices, whether it's a positional pawn sacrifice or a positional piece sacrifice. The easiest way to put it is you are sacrificing material to make your position easier to play. You essentially want a square for all of your pieces, and you want it to be very unclear how your opponent unwinds his position or where your opponent puts all of his pieces. And that is the common thread that goes across all of these positional sacrifices. And of course, then you're going to ask the question, how do we know when the positional sacrifice is worth the material, and how do we know when it isn't? Well, a lot of that just comes down to experience. Looking at tons and tons of chess games and looking at examples like this and seeing, okay, this works. If I can get something similar to this, then my idea should work as well. So d5 is what Karpov played, cd5, and then bishop b5 got played, a6, and then we have this attack starting on the dark squares, which of course this poor bishop that can't move at all can't defend against anything on the dark squares. And this is part of this positional sacrifice. The queen will be able to shuffle back and forth between all of these dark squares, and it's connected to all of them. Meanwhile, the king is never going to be able to find shelter because it always has to go onto these dark squares. And that's another repeated theme that you're going to see when it comes to positional sacrifices. King safety. King safety is always a big deal with any type of sacrifice of material. But a long-term king safety issue can be compensation for a lot of things. Black's king safety issue is not a short-term problem once that pawn got sacrificed and all the dark squares got opened up. Now Black's king safety issue is a long-term problem. He will never be able to find safety because the dark squares are all completely open. All of his pawns are on light squares, every single one of them. So we have king d8, and then we have queen a5 check, king e7, queen b4 check, king f6, queen d4 check, and as you can see, Anatoly Karpov has no problem just continually harassing the king. King back to e7, and then bishop d3. And again, this is frustrating for Black. Black has to find a way to solve his problems. His king is in the middle of the board. White has freedom of movements for all of his pieces. Black needs to find a way to find shelter, hide his king, get the rest of his pieces out. It's not clear how he does that. He has to play a move like, king f8, f6, king g7, rook f8. If he can get all that in, maybe he's okay. But how is he going to get all that in when White has all the tempo in the world to keep improving his position? So here we have queen h5, and then we have h4. And this is giving Black some additional problems. Now maybe we can trap Black's queen. Also, with the queen putting pressure on f8, you can't make a move like king f8 because you're going to be hanging your rook. So it is really unclear how we fix all of this. So Black tries to fix it with king d8, and then we have knight g5, and as you can see now we've got all kinds of multiple problems. There's problems on the e6 square. For example, if White takes twice, this rook on h8 is again hanging, and of course there's issues with the queen potentially getting trapped as well, or running into some problems on the h5 square. So we have rook h to f8, and then we have bishop e2 attacking that queen. We have queen to h6, and then we have bishop f3 going after this pawn on d5. Again, the queen is uncomfortable. This rook on f8, it's not a whole lot better than it was on h8, although at least it's not hanging in some cases. After knight e6, fe6, rook e6, at least the rook on h8 isn't hanging with check. But again, how do we solve all these problems? Rook e7, queen b4, knight f6, queen d6 check, rook to d7, queen back to f4, hitting this loose knight on a dark square, hitting this queen, threatening knight e6, which would pick up the queen, knight to g8, only real defensive try, bishop to g4, again going after this poor bishop, king to c8, trying to find shelter on the queen side, but of course there's also no shelter over there. Again, this is one of those situations where the king safety issue is in fact long-term. So bishop e6, pawn captures e6, and then we have rook c1 check, king back to d8, knight captures e6. So now the queen is hanging. This is check. And then, of course, the rook on f8 is hanging as well. So now we have king e7, and now, of course, this positional advantage just turned into a material advantage. And after rook h3, effectively, White's going to be winning this endgame. Although Black did play on for a few more moves, which he should, because at least the frustration is over here. At least now his pieces have freedom of movement, even though he's down in exchange. So I'll just show the rest of the game, even though it's not horribly relevant for what we're learning here. Eventually, Black did decide to resign because the position is unsavable. It's White is up in exchange. White has the initiative, and of course, White also has this very, very advanced pawn on h6, which he can eventually push through, or at least push through in a fairly meaningful way. Even a simple idea like rook g8, rook g7 should be enough to start pushing his material through over here on the king side. So that's the example I was always shown for a positional pawn sacrifice. But of course, there's also examples of positional piece sacrifices, and there's also examples of other ways to sacrifice pawns. So one idea that I think is kind of interesting is we can run into something kind of called a sealer sack, like d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, and then let's say that black decides to play something relatively passive, like he castles, and then we play bishop d3, and then we have a move like c6, for example, that just doesn't do, much of anything. We can play e5, and okay, they got to find a square for the knight. Let's say they play this knight back to d7. Now, again, what's interesting about this position is if you put this on an engine will spit out multiple moves that you can try with white to try to play for an advantage. I mean, white's already effectively cut the board in half. White has an advantage in space. But one move that's certainly possible here is to play something like e6. And this is effectively kind of what we call like some kind of sweeper sealer sacrifice. In a way, it's sort of the same theme of what we had in our last example. And again, we can break this down and make this even simpler. It's going to be easier for white to move his pieces after this than it's going to be for black to move his pieces. So we can sacrifice with e6, and after fe6, it is very difficult for black to finish his queenside development because this pawn is in the way. And we've also created we've made black's kingside weaker. As opposed to like if we just left the pawn on e5 and attacked with h4, h5 and tried to break up the position that way, where black is going to have two pawns that can recapture on the g6 square. Now if we go after this same attack with h4, h5, this pawn structure over here is significantly weaker on the king side, which lends itself to be broken up more easily. So again, when you're playing these types of sacrifices, you have to use your intuition and you have to use your experience and your judgment to determine if this is going to be enough compensation for the fact that you gave up a pawn. Because invariably, when you throw these positional sacrifices on the engine, even though like modern engines, I mean, the modern engine does not hate the move e6, it likes it. But it's not like a slam dunk. It's not like, hey, e6 is better than every other move in this position. Other moves in this position are certainly possible. You can play h4, h5 and get a similar attack without sacrificing the pawn. So playing a move like e6, it's partially intuition, but partially a deep understanding of what's going on positionally. After the capture, it is difficult for black to finish the development of his queenside, and black's kingside is weaker. Now, if we look at this on the engine recommends the immediate knight g5, although h4 seems to simply transpose into the same line that the engine gives. So knight g5, knight f6, h4, and we're just going for this breakup with h5. Now here, the engine only gives white a slight to major advantage after black plays perfectly. So if black plays perfectly with queen e8, which already is kind of an awkward move to find on its own, but if black tries queen e8, and this is why these sacrifices are intuitional, they're very good on a human scale. Black has to find some anti-intuitional moves to unwind his pieces because the traditional routes of development are not going to be available. He's not going to be able to put his bishop on a natural square like f5 or g4 because this pawn is in the way. And also, white usually doesn't rush to capture this pawn, again, because that pawn is in the way. This is a problem that black needs to solve. So the computer gives h5, and then g takes h5, and then knight on c to e4, h6, and then knight f6 who's given by the machine, and then takes on f6, and then an interesting move here to just cash out is knight h7, and apparently black has nothing better than just to give up this exchange. Obviously on rook f7 we have either queen h5 or bishop g6, both look very strong, and white should have some sort of advantage, so the computer just wants to play something like e5, takes on f8, takes on d4, king f2 is slight edge white, only slight edge. Black at this point has unsealed his position. Now he can develop his pieces more naturally, but again, he's down in exchange. Sort of similar to what happened in the Karpov game, where Yusupov was finally able to get out of this big problem, but in order to solve his problem, he ended up being an exchange down. So knight h7 is reasonable there. It's also reasonable to play knight e4 according to the engine, and then after something like queen e7, knight g3, going after this pawn on h5. And now our sealer sacrifice, while temporary, has managed to yield some dividends, especially on these light squares. So something like h4, rook takes h4, f5, rook h3, bishop d4, and then queen e2. Rook f7, rook takes h6, knight d7, bishop d2, bishop takes b2, rook b1. And again, this is a very long computer line. Rook e6, queen h4, rook e8 check, knight f8. Queen f3, rook e7, queen e7, king f2, queen f7, rook h1 is considered major advantage white according to the engine. So super long computer line. I don't expect you to memorize the whole thing, but basically black solved the majority of his development problems, but again, at a price. So now white is going to be breaking through in this position on the king side. White has all of his pieces aiming at the king side, and black is going to need to give something up to stop that attack. So that's one example of a sealer sacrifice. Another example of a sealer sacrifice is what I like to call the sealer sacrifice that isn't. And it comes up also in the perk, and it comes up in these types of perk positions, but it comes up in this line c5. There is this absolute main line that runs bishop b5 check, bishop d7, e5, knight g4, and then e6. And on the surface, it looks like the same type of sealer sacrifice. But what's interesting is it doesn't actually seal anything. So when you're looking at this f captures e6, knight g5, bishop takes b5, nothing is actually sealed into the position for black at this point. Black can develop the remainder of his pieces naturally. Black can play knight c6, rook c8, etc. This pawn never has to move in order for black to finish his development. So what is the compensation here for white? Why is this considered mainline theory? Well, the compensation for white is, of course, that this structure is quite a bit weakened. The structure of the kingside pawns, for example, which might lend itself to sacrifices in the future, like knight h7, or might lend itself to breakthroughs on the g6 square, and of course the weakened square e6 as well. So this is one of those things, like if you're actually sealing in your opponent's pieces, you typically don't want to take the doubled pawn involved in the sealer sacrifice, because your goal is to keep that pawn there as long as possible and prevent them from developing. But if you're making that sacrifice just for the purposes of weakening their structure, the opposite is essentially true. You do want to occupy that square as quickly as possible, because that's why you sacrificed the pawn. You sacrificed the pawn to occupy that weakness. So in this case, we would have something like, Queen G4 is a possibility. This is one of the mainline theory moves. And we have this John Nunn game that continued Bishop C4. And white, if you look at these lines really deeply on the engine, it turns out that white probably doesn't have quite enough to compensate for this. But this has always been one of my more favorite approaches to the position, is to play it like this and eventually target these sort of extended weaknesses on the king side. Now, the current theory states that instead of queen g4, probably the more direct route, something like knight e6, is better. And as a matter of fact, this leads to an immediate draw by force after bishop takes d4 if you choose to take the queen. Knight takes queen, bishop f2, king d2, bishop e3 is draw by perpetual, which is entertaining. But it's also possible to take the bishop on b5. This is following Nakamura versus Harry Christia, played back in 2012, that continued queen a5 check, queen d2, bishop f2 check, king d1, knight e3 check, king e2, queen takes, king takes, knight g4 check, king g3, queen d7, and then rook e1. And then after knight c6, we of course had b3, knight back to h6, bishop b2, knight f5, king f2, knight on c to d4, and then g4. And white has a lot going for him here, and actually white ended up going on to win. So in these types of positions, we are actually sort of keen to occupy those squares, as opposed to keeping it sealed. As you can see, black had no problem finishing his development, even with his king still stuck in the middle of the board. He can still get all of his pieces out. So we're not going to restrict him on a level that high, but we are going to be able to take advantage of these weaknesses that have just appeared in a position. So the final game to kind of demonstrate that is going to be this game, Bobby Fischer versus Spassky World Championship match 1972, which was another Queen's Gambit game. And I think it illustrates really well sort of exactly what's going on here. We have all this stuff. Bishop h4, b6, and then cd, cd, takes, queen a4, bishop e6, rook c1, queen a3, bishop b5. And that game continued a6, and you can see Fischer's taking advantage of all these pins. And then cd4, cd4, castles, rook a7, and then we have bishop e2, knight d7, and then knight d4. And of course, this isn't a sacrifice because he can't take it because he would be losing his queen. So he has to defend his queen. So we have this queen f8, and then we have knight e6, fe6, and then e4, which was just an absolutely incredible move. So it sacrifices a pawn. So what's the idea behind this pawn sacrifice? It's obviously not a sealer sacrifice. We're not sealing in anything. All of Black's pieces are already out and developed and functioning and doing stuff just fine. It is a sacrifice simply to create weaknesses. Now, it's worthy to note that Spassky declined the sacrifice. He played d4, which was actually somewhat terrible. Actually, after d4 and then f4, White was able to wrench this weakness on e6 without any trouble, and Fischer won a brilliant game and just made it look absolutely easy. And the irony of that is, of course, the problem with d takes e4 is that White will be able to wrench this weakness with impunity, and probably would have had a game that was fairly easy. But what's interesting is the strategy was pretty much the same. Like whether the pawn got pushed or whether the pawn got captured, the strategy of going after e6 was going to be basically identical. You know, Fischer would have played something like queen h3, simply targeting that pawn directly, and then bishop c4, simply targeting that pawn directly, and you know, he would have had, you know, some sort of slight advantage with the white pieces. Now, all of this stuff being said, I do want to give one more example because, of course, these sacrifices, these intuitive sacrifices, they don't just have to be with pawns. Sometimes they can be with whole pieces. There was a very famous example of this in the Alekhine's defense after e5, knight d5, d4, d6, knight f3, d takes, and then knight d7. This is very possible. And I think when this stuff first got seen, you know, for the first couple times, the people that were taking on F7, you know, they weren't using computer preparation. They weren't able to work these lines out all the way. And you just have to base how you feel about the compensation based off of your understanding of, okay, how unsafe or safe is Black's king, and of course how permanent is that unsafety. And of course now we have modern engines, we can work these lines out fairly well. We understand that Black probably that the piece is probably not enough compensation for how unsafe his king is going to be. These lines are very complicated. Queen h5, king e6, g3, and then, you know, if we had something like knight on 7 to f6, we could have bishop h3, queen d6, and then bishop jack back to g2, and 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 this is advantage white. And you know, we know that looking at these positions, we know that this is advantage white, and we know that similar tries in this position are advantage white. Instead of knight on 7 to f6, there's of course other ways to play this. b5 is another way to play it, and there's multiple ways to play this. And of course, at the very, you know, lowest level, at that scholastic level, of course, the positional sacrifice that comes up all the time is going to be that fried liver attack. That knight f6, knight g5, you have the sacrifice of a pawn, and Black actually sacrifices the pawn for activity if he plays knight a5. But if Black plays knight d5, we sacrifice a whole piece for essentially the same idea. Let's get this king to come out and play, and let's have a king that's long-term unsafe, but not necessarily any clear way to checkmate it, you know, in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 moves. We just have to have enough experience to understand that we have compensation for the material. And of course, now when engines look at this, they can work these positions out a little bit better. And pretty much all the engines universally like White at this point, and think that White has more than enough compensation for the material, but Black doesn't have quite enough material to compensate for the fact that his king is on e6. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you found it useful. I hope you learned an awful lot more about positional sacrifices and how to make them, and how to play chess after you make them, and what types of situations you can make those sacrifices in, and what types of situations you can't. The main thing that you need to do is just go over a lot of games. You need to practice this stuff, and you need to kind of learn on your own what works and what doesn't work. Anyways, thank you very much for watching.